So today, once again, good afternoon, all of you. Today, first I will start the delta modulation experiment, which is the third experiment in our digital communications lab. So in this today's lab session, here I am going to explain the theoretical part of the delta modulation. That is, what is delta modulation and why it is used, and how to produce the delta modulated signal, and all the things I will explain based on the fundamental block diagram theoretically, and after that the same delta modulation I will again explain by using the hardware kit also. So now let us see what is the delta modulation. So this is the general block diagram of the delta modulation. So all of you observe in the left side diagram, this is what the general block diagram, that is a theoretical block diagram, what we are analyzing in our theoretical subject, and the right side diagram is nothing but the practical implementation of the delta modulation in our laboratory kit. Okay, first we'll see what is this and what is delta modulation. So delta modulation is nothing but modification of or modification technique for a PCM. Here, what is a PCM means? Pulse code modulation is used to convert analog signal, this kind of analog signal, into a digital signal like this, like high and low pulses are in the form of binary bit sequences, that is ones and zeros. So finally, we need to convert this analog signal to digital signal either by using PCM or by using delta modulation or by using adaptive delta modulation. The final purpose is to convert analog signal to digital signal. Okay, but here how this delta modulation is different from other techniques. Other techniques in the sense PCM or DPCM. So in PCM technique, general way of converting analog signal to digital is by using sampling, quantization, and encoding. In PCM, each sample value is directly passed through the quantizer and then encoded. That means this quantizer will approximate each sample value separately, and then each quantized value is separately encoded. That is the actual process. But in delta modulation, instead of sending each and every sample, but we are sending the difference between the present sample and previous value of the sample. That means simply the difference between the samples is going to be quantized and then encoded. Okay. The main difference between delta modulation and PCM is, in PCM we are quantizing each and every sample, but in delta modulation we are quantizing only the difference between the samples. That is the main difference. And second difference is, in PCM we have only sampling block, quantization, and then encoding. Only fundamental process is there. After sampling, quantization, after quantization, encoding. But in delta modulation we are having one more feedback path around this quantizer. So in this feedback path we have a delay element. If you observe in a differential PCM, instead of this delay element we have a prediction filter. But instead of that, in delta modulation we are using delay element. So this delay element will simply give the previous value of this input. Whatever may be the input coming here, the previous value of this value is coming as the output. So for example, if you represent this as u of nts, the previous value of this is obtained after the delay element, that is u of n minus 1 ts. That is very simple operation. And the type of quantizer used in this delta modulation is known as 1-bit quantizer. Of course, it is a uniform quantizer only. That means the step size is always constant, as like in PCM. But the number of bits used for encoding is only 1 bit. If you want to know how many number of levels are there in this quantization, then you can have the relation like L equal to 2 power n, where L is the number of levels in the quantization and n is the number of bits required to represent each level. Now, based on this relation, we can say that when we are using 1-bit quantizer, instead of n, we can replace it 1. So, total number of levels in this quantization process is equal to only 2. That means what is the meaning of this 2-level quantizer? That means the quantizer will approximate this input value to any of the two levels. To any of the two levels. Here, what are the two levels? Here, levels are nothing but the different amplitude values of the quantization. Here, the two levels are having the amplitudes either plus delta or minus delta, where delta is the step size of the quantization used in the delta modulation. Okay, here that means all of you carefully observe how this quantization process works in delta modulation. Initially, if you observe the sample signal, this is the present sample value, and this is what the previous value of the staircase waveform, that is approximated staircase waveform, that like this. And how it is obtained? How this approximated staircase waveform is obtained, and how to compare the present sample value with this one. All of you observe that there is a summation here. After the summation, the input is given to the delay, and simply the delay element is giving the previous value of this one. So how this input is applied? This input is nothing but the summation of the previous value of the staircase waveform plus the output of the delta modulation. Here, what is the output of the delta modulation? The output of the delta modulation can be either plus delta or minus delta. That means the output of the delta modulation, that is D of NTS, let us say, that is equal to either plus delta or minus delta. That means either positive amplitude or a negative value. So if plus delta is coming as the output of the delta modulation, to the previous value of the staircase waveform, plus delta is added, so that the step size is increased like this. Next, in the next sampling time, if the output of the delta modulation is obtained as minus delta, then to this previous value, minus delta is going to be added, so that sometimes the step size may be decreases. So like that, depending on the output of the delta modulation or quantizer, based on that addition here, the step size may increase, and the staircase waveform may increase or decrease. Okay, so like that, there is a approximated staircase kind of waveform is obtained at this particular summation output. If it passes through the delay element, simply it will produce the previous value of this staircase value at that particular sample instant of time. For example, if this is the present value, this is the previous value. So this previous value is obtained here. Now, what we are doing here is we are going to take the difference between the sample value and previous value of the staircase waveform, and that difference value is going to be quantized or approximated to any of these two levels. For example, if you are getting that difference value is positive, suppose the present sample value is greater than the previous value, so that the difference is going to be positive. If you are getting the positive difference, automatically the output of the quantizer will be plus delta. If you are getting the negative difference, that means the input value is less than the staircase waveform, then we are getting minus delta. So based on plus delta or minus delta at the output of the quantizer, again the staircase waveform is updated like this. So this is what is happening in the delta modulation. Now, if you observe the comparison of present sample value and this staircase waveform in a graphical representation, you can have this one. For example, let us consider any kind of input signal like this. So from this input signal, if it is passed through sampler, then these are the number of samples. So these are the number of samples. The difference between any two samples, the time difference is nothing but the sampling time. Okay, that means for every sampling time, we will get one sample value and one step size changes. Next, this is what the approximated staircase waveform that is generated at this particular input. And how it is generated? Initially, if you assume there is a initial value of the staircase waveform, let us assume this one, and it may be positive or negative. Then, by comparing the present sample value to the previous value of the staircase waveform, then it is clear that the present sample value is greater than the previous value of the staircase waveform. So the difference is positive since it is greater than this one. So if the difference is positive, the output of the delta modulation will be obtained as plus delta. Next, in the next sample, again the present sample value is greater than the previous quantized waveform or previous approximated waveform. Present sample value again greater than this one, so again plus delta. And the next sample value again, the input value or present sample value is greater than the previous value, so again plus delta. Like that, plus delta, plus delta, plus delta are coming at the output of the delta modulation. These plus deltas are coming up to some point. And after this point, if you clearly observe, the present sample value or present input value is uh, if you observe this point, the present input value or sample value is less than the previous approximated staircase waveform. So that means here at this particular point the difference is negative. So if the difference is negative, difference negative means input is less than the previous value of the staircase waveform. So if the difference is negative, automatically we will get minus delta as the output. So here at this point minus delta are coming, here also minus delta, and so on. Somewhere else again plus deltas are coming. So like that, plus delta, minus delta values are coming at the output of the delta modulation. For example, if you observe what are the amplitudes of these delta, for example, the step size value or delta, you can say that delta with representation with symbol, with this symbol or this symbol. In some textbooks, it is represented with delta symbol. In some textbooks, it is represented with small delta symbol. Okay, so there is no difference between this variation of the symbols. You can represent with any symbol, no problem. Okay, but why it is taking in small delta and delta modulation in some textbooks is because the step size value in delta modulation is very small. So that's why some representation is small delta only for delta modulation. So don't worry about the representations. So just observe that the output of the delta modulation can be positive amplitude or negative amplitude. Positive amplitude so for some duration, negative amplitude for some duration. Then finally, what is the final encoded digital data? If you clearly observe that there is no separate encoder used in the delta modulation, the quantizer output is directly considered as the modulation output. When it is saying that it is a modulation output, finally it is a digital output. So why it is saying that it is a digital output means, since we know that plus delta is nothing but a positive amplitude, minus delta is nothing but a negative amplitude. So whenever we have a plus deltas, we have a positive pulse. Whenever we have minus delta, we have negative pulses. So like that, we'll get positive and negative pulses of the waveform. So which is considered as the digital output directly. So if you want to write the corresponding bit sequence of the delta modulation output, the corresponding bit sequence is nothing but whenever you get a positive pulse, in that positive pulse, by comparing the sampling time, for each sampling time we'll get one binary 1 or 1 bit. So this is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and then 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 1, 1, 1, and so on like this. So this is what the final digital bit sequence at the output of the delta modulation. Is that clear? This is what the theoretical part. This thing you must know before going to understand the experimental part of the delta modulation, right? So now just observe the difference between this theoretical analysis and how the same diagram is implemented practically. So as you know that the practical way of implementing sampling is sample and hold circuit. That is a flat top sample signal. Then after the sampling, we need to use some comparator here. It must take the difference between these, or it must compare these two inputs. So for the purpose of comparison, here we are using the op-amp comparator or any comparator. So it will compare this present sample value with the previous value of the staircase waveform. So that previous value of the staircase waveform is obtained from a block which is called as the integrator block. Here the symbol is known as integrator block. That means this delay operation can be performed by using a integrator also. So that integrator output is obtained here by comparing these two. If the present sample value is greater than this one, then the output will be positive. If the output will be positive value, so whenever you are applying a positive amplitude to the D flip-flop, then what is the output? Automatically the D flip-flop will produce a binary 1. If you are applying a negative value, automatically D flip-flop will give the negative pulse or a binary 0. So like that, binary 1 and 0s are coming like this as the output of the deep waveform. So here it is mentioned that it is a PCM output. Since all the outputs are in a digital form which look like a PCM, so that's why generally they are mentioning as a PCM output. But let us assume that this is a delta modulation output. Okay. So only the difference is, in place of this summation we have a comparator, in place of this delay element practically they are using integrator. That's it. Okay. So after the quantization, the quantization process involving this comparison as well as the DP. That is only the thing that is going to be implemented in a hardware kit. Now we are going to explain. I am going to explain about the hardware implementation of this particular delta modulation. Now all of you observe, this is the general waveform, but how the waveforms are generally observed based on this particular kit along with integrator. This is what the sampling clock, and this time period is nothing but the sampling time period. For each sampling time period, we have a number of samples. Let us consider this yellow color line is the random input signal, and this input signal is going to be compared with the integrator output. Here is going to be compared with the integrator output. This integrator output is can be considered like a staircase waveform. Okay, that means if you zoom this blue color line, in the CRO screen, then inside that you can clearly observe that there are some step size like this. Okay, it will be like this. That means there is a kind of staircase waveform is obtained as I have explained like this. So by comparing these two, if the present sample value, for example, this is the one sample value, this is another sample. The present sample value is greater than the previous value of the staircase waveform, automatically we will get plus delta as the output. Plus delta means binary one. So again in the next sample time, again input value is greater than the previous value. So again plus delta is coming. So again 1 is coming. So again 1 is coming. But here the input is less than the staircase waveform. So 0 is coming. That is minus delta. Again 0, again 1, and so on like this. This is the final digital output after the delta modulation, having ones and zeros like this. Here, how to observe this bit sequence in delta modulation or adaptive delta modulation? That is very important. Okay, that means, for example, if anybody say observed a digital output like this, so some students are observing the binary sequence as 1 0 1 0 1 0 and so on like this. But it is not 1 and it is not 0. It contains some number of ones. It contains some number of zeros. So we need to compare this digital output with the clock pulse or a sampling clock based on each sampling time. In each sampling time, we will get one bit. Either it may be 0 or 1. Okay, here we are getting 1, here we are getting 0. In this particular sampling time, we are getting again 1, 1, 1, and then 0, and so on. Like that, finally, you need to write in your observation that the final bit sequence of the delta modulation is like this. Okay, now we'll see what is the hardware kit is there. So if you observe this, that in this particular hardware kit of delta modulation, it contains some number of blocks. That means by using this particular hardware kit, you can do an experiment on delta modulation, and also you can do an experiment on adaptive delta modulation, or you can do an experiment on delta sigma modulation. This is a different kind of modulation which is not there in our syllabus. So try to observe that by using a single kit, we can do many number of experiments. But in this particular experiment, our focus is how to do an experiment on delta modulation. If you observe that, this is the same block what I have explained here. Okay, what I have explained here. Now, how to observe the delta modulation output and how to compare the output with the previous value, all these things we'll see. If you observe this particular diagram carefully, then there are some different switches are mentioned in this diagram. All of you carefully observe that. The first switch is called as modulation technique selection. That means by pressing this switch, each modulation technique will be enabled. For example, if you press this switch once, then delta modulation will be enabled. That means this LEDs will glow on. Next, if you press this switch again, all these switches are push button switches. That means if you press it again, adaptive delta modulation is enabled. If you press it again, next modulation is enabled. So that means whatever the technique you are using to perform experiment, you need to enable by using this switch. Similarly, here there is a signal generator which is having two options, external and internal. That means you can give signal from externally or internally. Generally, we are setting to internal because we have a different number of signals already generated internally. Okay, and all of you observe that there is no circuit connections or wired connections for this particular kit. All these devices and inputs and connections are already default. They are connected by using the PCB layout, so no need to do any connections. Okay, but you need to observe what are the different outputs are coming for different variations of the input parameters. Now if you observe that there are different signals are there, you can generate sine wave, square wave, triangular wave, or any arbitrary random signals also. By pressing this switch, each signal will be enabled. Similarly, if you are selecting sine wave, the corresponding frequency of the sine wave is also be selected by using this switch. By changing this switch, you can select any of the frequencies. Similarly, for all these modulation technique, this is the input pin. By default, this input is connected to this one. Okay. By default, this input is connected to this pin or here or here. So no need to do any wired connection. By default, they are connected. And similarly, a sampling clock is by default connected to this point. Okay, because if you want to do a sampling process, then we need two signals. One is a sampling clock, another one is the analog signal. So this sampling clock is by default connected to this particular point from this particular section. If you carefully observe that this section contains the sampling frequency selector. That means by changing this switch, by pressing this switch, we can able to select the frequency of this sample clock as 16 kHz, 32 kHz, or 64, and so on. So like that, we have a different switches in order to change the different input parameters. Based on this, you can select any of the input with any frequency and a clock with some corresponding clock frequency or a sampling frequency. Then you need to observe the sampled output here and corresponding integrator output here. Then we need to compare this sample value with the previous value. If the difference is positive, the output will be plus delta or a binary one. Or if the difference is negative, the output will be minus delta or binary 0. So like that, binary ones and zeros are coming at the output of the delta modulation. So that is what we are going to observe, right? And coming to the demodulation, here in the demodulation process, we generally use an integrator or a low pass filter. Okay, you can do demodulation here or here. That means by directly connecting the CRO probe at the output of the low pass filter, so you can directly obtain the demodulated waveform. And because all these things are internally connected, right? Now let us see. This is the comparison of input and staircase waveform. So how these waveforms are generated means, if you connect the CRO probes, one at this point and second at the integrator output. Okay, if you connect one CRO probe at the input, that is a sine wave, and another CRO probe at the output of the integrator, that is nothing but the approximated staircase waveform. Then if you observe this in a dual mode in the CRO, you can clearly observe that this is the input signal and this is what the approximated staircase waveform. So simply by comparing the input with this approximated staircase waveform, that is, for example, if this is the present value and this is the previous value of the staircase waveform, if the present value is greater than this one, automatically plus delta is coming. If it is plus delta, then positive pulse is coming. If it is minus delta, negative pulse is coming. Like that, you can clearly observe what is the output of the delta modulation. Similarly, we can have some comparison between sampled signal and approximated staircase waveform. That means here I am going to compare this sampled output and again the approximated staircase waveform after the integrator. So if you connect these two CRO probes, so this will be the output. So one of them is sampled signal and other one is the approximated staircase waveform. So in this particular comparison, you can clearly do the delta modulation quantization process. That means the present sample value is compared with the previous quantization or previous value of the staircase waveform. If the present value is greater than this one, automatically plus delta is coming. Again, if the present sample value is greater than the previous value of the staircase waveform, again plus delta is coming. That means during these entire portions, the present sample value is always greater than the previous value of the staircase waveform. That means during all these portions, we are getting a positive pulse. Again, during this portion, let us say this is the sample value. During this portion, the present sample values are always less than the previous value of the staircase waveform. That means during this portion, you will get a negative pulse. Again, during this portion, you will get a positive pulse, and again, negative pulse like this. So, like that, the delta modulation output is obtained like this, having positive pulse and negative pulse like this. And how to observe the final bit sequence? How to observe the final bit sequence? So this pulse containing some number of ones, and again this pulse containing some number of zeros. So how to observe that? That must be compared with the clock pulse or a sample signal. That means for each clock time period we have a sample value. For each sample value we will get one bit. For example, this is one sample value, so 1 is coming. Again there is another sample value, again 1, and again 1, again 1, and 1, and so on like this. So like that, the number of zeros we can count and write the corresponding bit sequence, right? So since in CR we can only observe two channels only, that's why only two comparisons are made. So based on that, we can able to draw the delta modulation output. For example, if you observe the delta modulation output compared with the input, so for example, this is the input before sampling, then based on the input, this will be the delta modulation output like this. This will be the delta modulation output. During this portion, we observe that there is a positive difference, so automatically we will get a positive pulse and then negative pulse like this. So this is what the final output of the delta modulation. Clear? This is when compared with the input signal. Now the corresponding bit sequence you should be identified while comparing with the clock pulse. Okay, while comparing with the clock pulse. Now we'll see how all these signals and comparisons are made by doing a hardware kit analysis. Now all of you let us carefully observe the hardware kit video which is conducted in the laboratory. So based on that video, it is very easy to observe the how the things are going on. And finally, this is the demodulated signal compared with the input. And if you observe that there are some demodulated signal may be having some less amplitude compared with the input. For example, this is the input and this is the demodulated signal. So of course there is a change in the amplitude, but the frequency must be same with respect to the input signal frequency. That's why the shape of these two are always same. This is what general thing what is happening in any type of demodulated signals. Now this is what the experimental procedure. So whatever I am explaining the procedure, those are written in a form of steps. So don't worry about these steps. So those things are already explained. So let us go to directly the experimental video. So all of you carefully observe this video so that it's going to be very easy to understand how delta modulation is generated. So this is what the kit of delta modulation. It contains a number of modulation techniques, but we need to select only delta modulation. And one more reminder is I keep on pausing this video so that I need to explain some points. So during that instances, I will pause the video and explain the things, right? So by changing this modulation switch, we can able to enable delta modulation and adaptive delta modulation and so on. So if this LED is glowing, that indicates that delta modulation is enabled. For example, if this LED is glowing, that means only adaptive delta modulation is enabled in this particular kit. Similarly for others also. So based on the LED glow, we can indicate that sine wave is selected and corresponding 500 Hz is selected as a frequency. Now let us see. By changing the switch, this LED is changing to different modulation technique. Okay. Similarly, when if you want to observe the input signal at this particular point, this is what the input signal. By default, it is connected to sine wave. If you press this switch, the type of signal is going to be changed. For example, this is a sine wave. Then if you want to change to square wave, simply by pressing this switch, it is this square wave is enabled. So square wave, triangular wave, other things. For example, square wave. This is what the square wave. By pressing the switch, you can have triangular wave and then arbitrary wave. Okay. So any kind of waves we can able to select from this switch. Next, by pressing this switch, you can have, or it is possible to select the frequency of the input signal. You can have the frequency of the input signal as 500 Hz or 1 kHz or 2 kHz and so on. So now let us see if the sine wave is selected, how frequency is changed. Here I am going to press this switch and observe the sine wave in the CRO. Frequency is changing, so sine wave frequency is keep on changing according to the switch. Now, how to observe the clock signal? So this clock signal is by default connected to this particular pin to the sampler circuit. So if you connect the CRO probe directly at this pin, you will get the clock signal in the CRO screen. Now let us observe the clock signal in the CRO screen. Okay. And how to change the clock signal frequency? Here clock signal frequency is nothing but the sampling signal or sampling frequency, that is Fs. The Fs is nothing but the clock signal frequency. If you want to calculate Ts, so you can easily obtain Ts is equal to 1 by Fs, right? And also we can verify the sampling condition also. Sampling condition is Fs greater than or equal to 2 Fs. Here Fs is 16 kHz and Fm is 1 kHz. So always 16 kHz is greater than 2 times of this one. Now, if you want to change the clock signal frequency, again press this switch again and again, so that this will be enabled to here, 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 and so on, like this. By pressing this switch, you can have sampling clock as 32 kHz frequency, 64, 128, 256, and so on. So if you observe that there is a variation in the frequency of the clock pulse. Okay. So while doing the experiment, connect input signal to any of the type and select the one frequency of the clock pulse and select one frequency of the input signal. Okay. By setting to any of the signal type with frequency and clock pulse with some particular frequency. Here, for example, I have taken a sine wave with 1 kHz signal frequency and a clock pulse with 16 kHz of sampling frequency. Now, after setting that, I am going to observe what is the sample output here. The sample output is obtained after the sample and hold circuit. This is what the sample and hold circuit are a sample signal simply. If you observe that, these are the sample values. These are the number of sample values depending on the sampling clock. Since it is a sample and hold circuit, each sample value is having a constant height like this. Yeah. Now let us see what is the integrator output. Here, what type of waveform is coming at the integrator output? Generally, the integrator output will be like kind of a triangular waveform in terms of some sort of kind of waveform. But if you zoom that, internally there is a staircase approximated signal or staircase kind of waveform. So we need to compare this sample value with the previous value of the staircase waveform, so that based on the comparison, the D flip-flop will produce either 1 for positive difference or 0 for negative difference. So for that purpose, here I am taking this integrator output. In the CRO, if you observe that, initially it will be like a triangular waveform, but if you particularly zoom this and carefully observe, there is a staircase kind of waveform like this. Okay. Now, so this is what the integrator output. Once again, it is showing. Now I am going to let us see this pin. There is one more switch is connected here, which is set to be gain control. This switch indicates that we can set the step size value in the delta modulation. That means we can fix the step size value in the delta modulation. That means by pressing the switch, the step size value in the delta modulation can be changed. For example, if you press this button, the step size is equal to 1 volt. If you press this button again, the step size may be changed to 3 volts. Like that, one or two values we can change the step size. But once the step size is changed, that value is fixed. That is not changing. Okay. But initially, while doing the experiment, you can set this step size value to either 1 volt or 3 volts, or 1 volt, 2 volts, or 3 volts. Okay. So like that, for selection of the step size, we can use this switch. That's only the purpose of this particular switch. Okay. For example, if you want to observe what is integrator output by changing this switch, all of you observe that this integrator output is obtained as a staircase waveform, that is as a steps, and the difference between these two steps is nothing but the step size, that is the height of the step. If we change that particular pin, then the height will be changed. So let us see. Automatically the height will be changed. Okay, that is only the purpose of this. Now I am going to observe the delta modulation output here. Delta modulation output. So connect the output CRO probe to the delta modulation and to the ground. So ground is connected here. So if you observe this output, this is what the output of delta modulation. So this delta modulation output is nothing but the digital output having positive and negative pulses are there. So if you want to observe how many number of ones in this positive pulse and how many number of zeros in this negative pulse, then you must compare this output with the clock pulse. So during each clock time or sampling time, one bit is generated, as I already explained. So let us see. Here, just for the comparison purpose, here I am taking comparison of input signal with the approximated staircase waveform. We made some comparison. This is what the comparison. Based on the comparison, you can easily observe how the delta modulation output is produced. For example, this is the input signal. This is the approximated staircase waveform. So by comparing the present value with the previous value of the staircase waveform, the present value is greater than this one, automatically positive value, that is plus delta, is coming as the output. Again, during this entire portions, only plus delta is coming because the input is greater than the previous value of the staircase waveform. So during this portion, we will get a positive pulse. During this portion, we will get a negative pulse. Okay. And also from the same diagram also, we can clearly observe that there is a slope overload distortion coming because the gap between input and approximation of staircase waveform is very large. So this gap is also called as slope overload distortion. So this slope overload distortion is eliminated in the adaptive delta modulation. So that will be explained later. Now just observe this comparison. Based on the comparison, we can have the delta modulation output. Again, for another comparison, we can take two CRO probes, one at sampled output, other one at integrator output. Then you can see that this is what the sampled output, this is what the integrator output having the approximated staircase waveform. So again, we can compare the present sample value with the previous value of the staircase waveform. Then if the present sample value is greater than this one, we will get a plus delta. And again plus delta, that means during this portion we will get a positive pulse, during this portion we will get a negative pulse. So like generated, like that the delta modulation output is generated. Clear? So in order how many number of zeros and how many number of ones are coming in this particular delta modulation output. For example, this is the delta modulation output. In that some ones are coming and in the negative portion some zeros are coming. So in order to observe how many number of ones and zeros are coming, we need to compare this output with the sampling clock. So here in the dual mode, I am connecting the output with the sampling clock in a dual mode to the two CRO probes by observing the time period of this clock pulse. For example, this is the time period of clock pulse. This is the first sampling duration. In the first sampling duration, one bit is coming, that is 1. Again during the second clock pulse, again 1. Again during the third clock pulse, 1, 1, 1, 1, and so on. Depending on number of clock periods are there, we will observe the number of bits in this corresponding output of the delta modulation. Clear? So here let us see how they are counting the number of bits depending on the clock pulse. Okay. For example, if you are selecting the input signal frequency to 1 kHz and clock signal frequency is equal to 16 kHz, then you can clearly observe that the output of delta modulation contains 8 ones exactly in the positive duration and 8 zeros exactly in the negative duration. Because 16 kHz is, when compared to 1 kHz, 16 kHz is 16 times. So 8 clock pulses in positive half cycle and 8 clock pulses in negative half cycle. That's why if you observe that during this period 1 is coming, during this second clock period again binary 1 is coming. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Sorry, up to this one 8. So 8 ones and then 8 zeros are coming as the binary bit sequence in the delta modulation output. Okay, that is where we need to observe what is the final digital bit sequence. So in order to observe the demodulation output, we can directly obtain the demodulation output at the output of the low pass filter. Then it is the comparison of the input and demodulation output. Okay. And one more thing you need to observe in the delta modulation is the delta modulation will give you the perfect outputs only when the input sampling frequency as high as possible. That means if the input sampling frequency is made to high value, then only you can do delta modulation or adaptive delta modulation more perfectly. I think in your theoretical subjects also, this is the major requirement for a delta modulation. The main requirement is you need to select the sampling frequency as high as possible. That means we need to have a oversampled signal for delta modulation. That's why if the sampling frequency is selected as only 16 kHz, that is less value, then the demodulation may not be perfect. But by increasing the sampling frequency to higher values, then you can clearly observe that there is a perfect improvement in the demodulation or reconstruction. Now let us see how demodulation is obtained by changing this sampling frequency. So here I am changing the sampling frequency to higher values. Okay. Now observe what is the demodulated output. Now you can clearly observe that there is a perfect sine wave is coming as the demodulated output when we increase this sampling clock or sampling frequency. For example, if you individually observe the demodulated output in the CRO, initially if the sampling frequency is selected as 16 kHz, so there is a demodulated signal of sine wave having very less amplitude and also with some distortion. Let's see how the variation in the demodulation. Now here I am increasing the sampling frequency so that you will get a perfect sine wave with a proper amplitude. Clear? This is what the requirement of delta modulation, that we need a high sampling rate or high sampling frequency to the sampler, right? So this is what the experimental kit and experimental analysis of delta modulation. So I have explained both the theoretical part and as well as practical implementation by using hardware kit. So based on the same knowledge, you can also do the same experiment in adaptive delta modulation also. That means since adaptive delta modulation is very similar to delta modulation, so the procedure for adaptive delta modulation is very similar to the delta modulation, and we'll do the adaptive delta modulation also in this class. For example, these are the observations we need to make after completing the delta modulation experiment. Those things are, we need to observe what is the input signal by varying the different input signal type. That means by changing the input signal type, we need to observe what is the type of input coming. Similarly, we need to change the frequency and observe what is the variation in the input signal. Similarly, observe the clock signal and note down the clock frequency and verify the sampling condition is satisfied or not. Observe the sampled output after the sample and hold cycle, and then observe the approximated staircase waveform at the integrator output. Based on this staircase waveform with the present sample value, we can observe the delta modulation output. So this delta modulation output which will vary with respect to the signal frequency and sampling frequency. So that means by changing the sampling frequency, try to observe delta modulation output. Similarly, by changing the input signal frequency, try to observe what is the delta modulation output. So for every input variations, we need to observe what are the variations in the delta modulation outputs and what is the bit sequence variation. Next, note down the corresponding digital bit sequence from the delta modulation output by comparing with the sampling clock. This is very important. All must observe what is the digital sequence after the delta modulation output. That must be compared with the clock pulse. For each and every clock period, we will get 1 bit. Next, finally, observe the demodulated signal at the output of the low pass filter and compare this with the original signal with amplitude and frequency parameters. Now, let us see adaptive delta modulation. So the main change in the adaptive delta modulation is, or if you observe that the diagrams are looking like very same. If you observe this particular part, so this part is nothing but the delta modulation. This part is nothing but delta modulation. So we are using same delta modulation, but only the difference is this one. We are just adding one more flaw to the delta modulation circuit so that this will perform automatic step size variation. So this is called as logic for step size control. So why we need this logic is in order to eliminate the drawbacks of delta modulation. Those are slope overload distortion and granular noise. So in order to avoid that, we need the variation of the step size according to the input signal variation. So for that purpose, we are going to add this logic for step size control to this particular quantization so that the step size value is adaptively changed according to the input signal variation. Now let us see why this is required, and we'll explain theoretically and then we'll move on to experimental case. So why this additional block is required for adaptive delta modulation. Now let us see. For example, this black color line is nothing but the general input signal having some variation is like this. So if you consider this input signal, this input is suddenly rising and then it does not vary as much during this portion. That means the signal is almost constant during this portion, and during this portion input suddenly rises. For example, if you apply this kind of input signal to the delta modulation only, then we know that in delta modulation always the step size is constant. That means this step height is always constant because we are using uniform quantization. So if you apply this signal to this delta modulation, so based on the two level of delta modulation quantizer, it will approximate the staircase waveform as like this. So it is only incremented with the fixed value of the step size like this. Even though the input is suddenly rises, so it cannot able to follow this up to this level because this height is only fixed. Only it will increase only up to this step size height only. It cannot increase more value because we are using the same uniform quantizer having constant step size. So if you observe that this is the approximated staircase waveform that is observed in the delta modulation, right? If you observe the gap between this input and red color line, that is approximated staircase waveform, there is a large gap is observed. So this gap is nothing but the quantization error that is known as slope overload distortion. Similarly, if you observe during this portion, even though the input is having very small variation, that means there is no variation in input signal, but the staircase waveform is approximated by using some proper step size. That means if you observe this height, even though it is small, but this height seems to be very high compared to this input signal variation because the input signal variation is very less. It is almost zero, no variation, but we are approximating with some height. So again, we observe that there is a small gap occur during this portion also between input and output. So that gap is called as granular noise. So in order to reduce these two errors in delta modulation, the solution is we need to increase the step size whenever the input signal rises, and then we need to reduce the step size whenever the input signal is having low variations. So if you observe the blue color line, it is clear that the step size is changing, increasing here and decreasing here. So if you observe that if the input signal suddenly rises, then automatically step size value is increased from delta to 2 delta, 3 delta, 5 delta and so on. Whenever the input signal is having very less variations, automatically step size is going to be reduced from 5 delta to minus 2 delta, 3 delta. That is, it is decreased to 3 delta, 2 delta, and delta, and so on. The way of, that is the process of changing the step size adaptively according to the input signal variation, then that type of technique is called as adaptive delta modulation. So that's only the difference between the delta modulation and adaptive delta modulation. So in order to make this step size variation, we need to have another block which is called as step size control logic block. That must be added to the quantizer. Based on this logic, inside this quantizer, the step size is going to be changed accordingly. It may be increase or decrease. Clear? Now, based on this comparison, we can have the digital bit sequence also. For example, here I am comparing the delta modulation output and adaptive delta modulation output. For example, this is given for, this is the digital bit sequence for adaptive delta modulation. Adaptive delta modulation. Because the process is same for delta modulation and adaptive delta modulation. Because how one is coming here, when we compare the input signal with the previous value of the staircase waveform, since the input is greater than the previous value, so the difference is positive, output is plus delta, that is binary mode. Again, if you observe that here input is less than the previous value of the staircase waveform, so that's why you are getting 0. Again, here input is greater than, so 1. Again, input is greater than 1. Again, input is greater than to this one, 1. Again, input is greater than this one, 1. If you observe here, the input is less than the previous value of the staircase waveform, so we are getting 0. Similarly, here input is greater than previous value of the step size, so difference is positive, so output will be 1. Whenever we find that the input is higher, always we get a binary 1. Whenever if we find the input is lower, we find output as 0. Like that, binary bit sequence is obtained at the output of delta modulation. So this bit sequence is completely different if you observe in the delta modulation, because in the delta modulation, if you observe that this is the approximated staircase waveform, that's the red color line. Based on this red color approximated staircase waveform only, we need to compare the input and the approximated output so that the delta modulation output is produced. For example, if you observe that starting from this point, one is coming, here one is coming because the input is greater than the previous value of the staircase waveform, that is red color line. So always input is high, so always we are getting 1. So here during this portion also input is high, again 1. During this portion also input is high, again 1, again 1, again 1. Up to this portion, it is clear that always the input is more than the previous value of the staircase waveform. So always ones are coming. Only after some point, zeros are coming. That means there is a complete difference between the digital output of delta modulation and the adaptive delta modulation. So this is actual digital output we need to generate, but by using delta modulation we are generating only ones. Here there must be some zeros also, but we are not generating zeros. Always ones are coming, because there is a large error in the error is there between the input and approximated staircase wave. So in order to overcome these drawbacks, we are using the adaptive delta modulation. So in the adaptive delta modulation, this block is added. Similarly, in the hardware kit also, in the implementation, the one more block is added as a step register or steps generator. Based on the step generator or register, the step size value is going to be changed, that is increased or decreased according to the input, right? And similarly here, the integrator output, whatever we observed in the delta modulation, same thing is obtained as the staircase waveform, and the process is same. Clear? Now we are using the same fundamental kit. Here, if you want to do the adaptive delta modulation, you can select or enable this particular block, and you can do the experiment on adaptive delta modulation. So the same things are there: input, clock pulse, sampled output, integrator output. By comparing these two, based on the difference, the output is produced either 1 or 0, or high or low pulses. Clear? When you press this switch, adaptive delta modulation is enabled like that. So the same procedure is there as like in delta modulation. Now if you want to observe the what is the experimental video of the adaptive delta modulation, so you can clearly observe that. Here again I am selecting the sine wave as the input, okay, and I am changing the sampling frequency. So just wait for 1 minute. Here input signal is selected. Okay. Now we'll see in the next video. In the adaptive delta modulation, here the same procedure is applied as is the delta modulation. So you need to observe input, clock pulse, sampled output. Here I am going to observe the what is the accumulator output or integrator output compared with the original input signal. Based on this comparison only, we will get either binary output as 1 or 0. So in the dual mode of CRO, I am connecting two CRO probes, one at input, another one at approximated staircase waveform. Here at this point, we can observe that what is the approximated staircase waveform. And as the input, for simplicity here I am taking the square wave as the input. So for this square wave, how this approximated staircase waveform is generated? Let us see. It is clear that in adaptive delta modulation, the step size is varied according to the input signal variation. Now let us see how the step size is varied. Now let us see. So here by changing the switch, you can enable the adaptive delta modulation. So if you observe that this process will change the, so all of you clearly observe that this is the input signal. Here when the input signal is suddenly rises or suddenly changes, automatically the step size value is increased. You can clearly observe that there is an increase in the step size. Similarly, if you observe at this particular portion, if this at this particular portion, it is clear that the input signal is having no variations, almost no variations. Whenever there is no variation in input signal, then the step size value is going to be reduced to very low level. So like that, by adaptively changing the step size value, we can able to approximate this input with the staircase waveform, so that based on this comparison, you will get the delta modulation output. Okay. Now let us observe what is the delta modulation output. So comparison of delta modulation output and adaptive delta modulation output for arbitrary input. For example, if you select any random input, what is the change in the delta modulation and adaptive delta modulation outputs? So simply here I am selecting the any arbitrary waveform, not like a sine wave or square wave. Let us consider a different kind of waveform as a random waveform. Here I am connecting to the delta modulation and observe what is the output of delta modulation. And again the same waveform is enabled for adaptive delta modulation. Now let us see what is the output of adaptive delta modulation. As I have already explained that the digital bit sequence at the output of delta modulation and adaptive delta modulation are different. So now in this particular video, we will explain how the different bit sequences are obtained for the same input. Clear? For example, this is the input. If you observe that this is the random input, okay, this is the arbitrary input is given to the adaptive delta modulation. So here we are observing the what is the output of the adaptive delta modulation in the CRO screen. If you clearly observe, this is what the digital output coming at the output of the delta modulation. If you remember this sequence, having some small positive pulse followed by a large negative pulse, that means small number of ones followed by large number of zeros. This is what the sequence. Next, if you use the same input to the delta modulation, if you enable the delta modulation, then if you observe the output of delta modulation for the same arbitrary input, then let us see the difference. Then it is clear that there is a change in the bit sequence. Okay, earlier this part is not there for adaptive delta modulation. That means here ones and zeros, again ones are there. So definitely there is a change in the digital bit sequence of the adaptive delta modulation when compared to the delta modulation. So in adaptive delta modulation, this variation in the digital bit sequence is due to the variation of the step size adaptively according to the input signal variations, so that the slope overload distortion and granular noise both are eliminated in the adaptive delta modulation because of using step size control logic. Okay, so that is the thing. So if you observe the demodulation output as the same when compared to the delta modulation. If you observe at the output of the low pass filter, it is easy to observe what is the demodulation output. So that is not given here. So you can easily observe what is the demodulation of the AD. Okay. So again, the observations are same with respect to the delta modulation, but here only the thing is finally we need to compare what is the adaptive delta modulation output with the delta modulation output for the same input signal. Then only you are able to observe what is the difference between delta modulation and adaptive delta modulation. Okay. So thank you all of you. This is what the class what I need to explain for this today's lab session.